Tina Barton. Tina Barton has a lot of experience with Michigan elections and national elections. Highlighting some of her experience, she served as a deputy clerk for Bloomfield Township previously, moved on to become the city clerk at the city of Rochester Hills, where she served for many years. It was 8 years. Is that correct?
Yes.
And during that time, she also served as president during one of those years at the Oakland County Clerks Association. Currently, she's a senior program advisor at the Election Assistance Commission. She also serves on the board of directors for both Leadership Oakland and Crossroads for Youth. She has a Master of Arts in Management and Leadership and has certified Michigan Municipal Clerk and Master Municipal Clerk designations. So just wanted to give an overview. Tina has a wealth of experience on elections, and we're really glad to have her today.
Thank you, Zach. It's really great to be with all of you. I appreciate this opportunity. I love working with students and young people, and I hope that a little bit of my excitement, love, and passion about elections and working in government kind of rubs off on you, maybe at least gives you a little bit of a taste of it. So I've been working in government for 31 years at varied levels, as Zach mentioned, also varied locations. I've worked for Oakland County as a production control analyst, worked at Bloomfield Township for 16 years and Rochester Hills for 8 years. And now I'm working for the federal government in one of the smallest agencies in the federal government, but it is nonetheless, we're here to do mighty work for election officials across the country. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity. Thanks, Zach.
All right, and I have the slideshow up finally here. So let me share this. And then, do you know, is there a way, let's see if I hit play from start. Is that working for everyone?
Yeah, that works for me. Can everybody else see that? Okay. All right, if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. So what I want to first I want to lay some groundwork about cities, villages, and townships. If you want to go ahead and move on. When you look at the cities and villages and townships in the state of Michigan, we have 83 counties. I think we might have missed a slide there.
All right, there we go.
There you go. So we have 83 counties in the state of Michigan, but we have like hundreds of villages, townships, and cities. And within each of those cities, villages, and townships, that's often referred to as a CVT. When people are talking about them, they'll talk about the CVTs, and what they mean are the cities, villages, and townships. And each of those units has different responsibilities and different products and services that they offer compared to the others. So for instance, villages do not run elections. Only cities and townships run elections. Most townships do not have their own road department. That's usually most cities. So there are some little quirky things based on the charter, based on the size of the community, but there are also some things in there that are hard, fast in law that are like villages not running elections. Go on to the next one. So what I'm going to talk to you today are two different things. I'm going to focus on the duties and responsibilities of clerks in Michigan. And then I'm also going to tell you a little bit about my new role at the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, serving as a senior advisor. So I want to start with duties and responsibilities of clerks. Next slide, please. So a couple of things to know that a lot of people don't are that some clerks are appointed and some clerks are elected. So all township clerks are elected, but most city and village clerks are appointed. However, there are some elected city clerks. So if you look like Detroit, Lansing, and Southfield, those are larger cities. Their city clerks are elected. But as a city clerk in the city of Rochester Hills, I was appointed by council. And as a matter of fact, I was the only employee in the city of Rochester Hills that was appointed by council and answered directly to the council. So the duties and responsibilities of a clerk can really vary, just like those of the CVTs that we have, based on the size of the community and whether they're a township or a city or a village clerk. but the majority of the duties and responsibilities of the clerk are specifically called out in that community's charter, as well as in state law. We'll call out what some of those duties and responsibilities are. Next slide, please. So, you know, I like to say that the clerk's office is kind of like Google for government, because the clerk's office is really where all the information is. It's where all the records are kept. And so because the clerks are most often deemed in their charters as the keeper of the records, they, to me, are the Google for government. If you need any type of document, if you need a resource, all of that is archived and kept and stored in the clerk's office. And so because of that fact, the clerks are typically the ones that are appointed as the FOIA coordinators for their community. So when you look at the FOIAs, the Freedom of Information Act requests that come into communities, it might surprise you to learn that as the clerk in the city of Rochester Hills, I would on average receive anywhere from 300 to 400 FOIAs per year. So a lot of time gets spent working on the records and responding to FOIA requests. That can be something as simple as, I would like the building history on my home, all the permits that have been pulled on this house. Or it can be something as much as looking at HR, you know, that they might say, I want to know, you know, what HR records I can have, you know, for this particular person. These are the records that I want. Or they might say, I want email exchanges between this individual and this individual between these dates or along this topic line. So FOIAs can vary greatly all across the board. Another responsibility with being the keeper of the record is the record storage. So the clerk has to really kind of determine, how are we going to store the records for our community? Are we going to store them in a vault where we keep paper copies of all the records? Or are we going to implement an imaging system in our community so that all of our documents, not only do we have a digital copy, but for some documents, we're required to keep original copies. So the clerk then has to determine what has to be an original copy that should be on file in the office in a vault, or what can be imaged and what can we store in the cloud. Clerks are often also responsible for liquor license applications. So if you've got new restaurants coming into your city, a new bar, or maybe you have a wine cellar type place where they're like selling bottles of wine and they want to do wine tastings, all of those types of applications actually go through your local clerk. So a few years ago, the state changed the requirements where local approval wasn't necessarily needed on all liquor license applications. Well, the local units were like, hey, wait a minute, you just took all of our authority and control over what types of establishments we're going to allow to come into our community that are going to serve alcohol. So a lot of local units all across the whole state in response made using selling liquor in their facilities to be a special use. So they got around the state requiring their approval on the liquor license application by saying, now, if you want to serve liquor in our community, we're considering this a special use for that particular zoning. And because of that, you still have to come before the city council, or you still have to come before the board of trustees. We also oversee solicitation applications. So all the people that are out knocking on your door and talking with you, those people all have to go, have to get a solicitation application submitted in most communities. Not in all is that required. I will also tell you that when I was the deputy clerk in Bloomfield Township, and then when I was the clerk in the city of Rochester Hills, I implemented background check requirements on those that were soliciting. So that means anybody in Bloomfield Township or in Rochester Hills that's knocking on your door trying to sell you something has gone through a background check through that local community, so that we can see, is the person knocking on your door, are they someone who has a history of domestic violence? And so, you know, are they someone that might be a potential physical threat to someone in your household? Is that someone who has a rap sheet with a lot of breaking and entering? Is it possibly they're using this job to like scope out your house? And so we do background checks before we will issue solicitation licenses in those two communities. Not all clerk's offices are passport acceptance agencies. Some of them are. Bloomfield Township is, Rochester Hills is. You can go there and apply for your passport. That also means that we have specific people in our offices that have to go through a process of becoming a passport agent. And so they have to go through training for that and go through specific audits. Depending on whether they're considered a dual facility or not, they have to go through audits either every 6 months, every year, or every couple of years. One of the other things we're responsible for are council, commission, and board packets. And I think Zach on this call has a lot of experience with that, but putting together the packets for all of these meetings. So all of the items that are going to be on your agenda, these are all of the things that we're pulling together, all of the plans that were submitted. If it had gone to the Planning Commission, to the Zoning Board of Appeals, anything like that, we have to pull all that documentation together. So when that final packet is put on the agenda to go to the council, commission, board, they can look at what steps has this gone through from point A to Z, so that now we're ready to take a vote on this and actually say whether this development can happen in our community. So keeping track of all of that it's a huge task, and most clerk's offices will have at least one individual who is specifically dedicated to doing nothing but packets and handling their council, commissioner boards. A lot of clerks are also appointed by their boards or commissions to sit on special committees. If they are looking into doing something new or something different, they'll form these ad hoc committees or advisory committees to come together. And a lot of times the clerk is appointed to serve on those because, as I mentioned already, the clerk is the keeper of the record and sees most of the documents that will come through that community. Some of the clerk's offices handle vital records. So when you look at vital records, I'm talking specifically about like birth and death records. So most of the clerk's offices that handle birth and death records, you have to have in Michigan, in order to do that, you have to have a hospital within your community that you are issuing those records for. So for instance, in Rochester Hills, we did do birth and death records. So if you were born or you died in Rochester Hills, you could get the birth or death record at the city of Rochester Hills because Ascension Hospital was located in Rochester Hills. Same thing goes for the city of Troy. They do birth and death records because they have Troy Beaumont. Royal Oak has Royal Oak Beaumont. So communities that have hospitals can do the birth and death records. Now, there are some cities who do not do the vital records, and as a community and you have a hospital, you can actually choose to turn that authority completely over to the county. So some communities that do have hospitals within their communities have chosen to do that, turn those birth and death records over to the county. As I mentioned, clerks often hold seats on committees created by the Planning Commission, ZBA. And then cemeteries. Okay, let me tell you, this was something when I went from Bloomfield Township to Rochester Hills, I went from never having overseen cemeteries to I had to learn about cremation. I had to learn about columbariums. I had to learn about, you know, what were all the trends in burial sites and what were people looking for when they went to be, you know, consider what their options were going to be for their long-term planning. So in Rochester Hills, I had 3 cemeteries. So one of them active burial site, 2 of them historical. So that was another thing that you had to learn and come up to date on all of the laws and the rules and restrictions of cemeteries. A lot of the clerks that are in smaller communities also do the accounting portion and the HR portion functions of their community. So the smaller the community, a lot of times the more varied those responsibilities are that the clerk has. We also, in some of the communities, have a youth council, which is basically, Rochester Hills had one. It's basically a youth version of high school students that operate as the council. They actually sit up with the council on the dais during council meetings. They attend all of our meetings that we have for committees, but they do not have a vote like council members do. So if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about Michigan's election system. If you want to go ahead and go on to the next slide. So we are one of 8 states that operates elections at a very decentralized level, which when you look at the other states and territories across the United States, most of them are operating their elections at a county level. So the county clerks are running the elections. In Michigan, we are only one of 8 states where the local clerks run the elections. So when you look at that, so instead of Oakland County or Wayne County running the elections, that's why you have the city of Rochester Hills, you have the city of Detroit, you have the city of Lansing, each of us running our own elections because we are one of very few states where we are decentralized. I think that what that does do for us is it adds this extra layer of checks and balances to the process. So when you look at the overall election system is, put forth in state law of the way that that works, and the qualified voter file that is used as a database to house all of those who are registered voters and your voting information, that is all a statewide system that we have. And then when you get down to the county level, at the county, they're doing things like programming the elections, and they're also doing things like canvassing the election. And then when you get to the local level, they're the ones that are actually administering the election. So no local clerk is actually auditing her own work. The county canvasses and audits the local, and sometimes the state will also audit the local unit. So there's this layer of checks and balances that exists in Michigan, which I think actually makes our democracy in this state stronger and makes the integrity of our elections even more pure because of that. So with that, we end up with over 1,600 local election officials when you include the counties and the locals here just in the state of Michigan. And that is amazing. So when you look at Michigan, we have like 1,603 voting jurisdictions, but you look at in Ohio, they only have 88. So just to give you a little, comparison of how we look compared to other states, in Indiana, they only have 92. So we are a little bit of an anomaly compared to other states. Go ahead. So this is an election administrator's competencies. And one of the things that I think is so amazing about being a clerk in the state of Michigan is you're expected to be an expert on so many things. I mean, we already talked about FOIA, right? We talked about liquor. We talked about cemeteries. You're expected to know all the laws regarding all of those topics and being an expert in them as a clerk. And a lot of people will look at our profession and think that they're like, oh, you run elections. Well, honestly, we run elections, but we do all the other stuff even more. Like that takes up more of our time than the elections do, but people think that all we do are elections. But when you look at the election administrator's competencies, the election administrator is really a program manager. We're looking at the entire project that we have ahead of us, which is the election, and all the things that all the things that have to be in place, all the things that have to be done well and done correctly and done by law and done legally by timelines that are put in law. And when you look at that, these are some of the competencies, like election law, obviously the foundation of all of that. Like what do we have to do according to the law? The finances of that, it's expensive to run an election. To run an average election in a city the size of Rochester Hills, I am budgeting anywhere between 70 to 90,000 for one election. And the greatest cost of running an election for us is that of hiring our election inspectors. And they're not even paid that much, to be honest with you. I mean, most of them are doing this with their training and everything included for around $200 to $250 per person. And so when you're looking at $200 to $250 per person, that may not sound like a lot, but in an average presidential election cycle in Rochester Hills, I would have hired approximately 400 people. So you can see where that budget really starts growing. We have to be on top of the ADA accessibility requirements, like how heavy, what's the poundage on the door when the door goes to close? So there's a specific poundage on the door so that we have to check and make sure every door we're going to have in a precinct meets ADA requirements. Security, we're talking about you're talking about physical security of the building. You're also talking about election security when it comes to like chain of custody. Then you're also looking at things like cybersecurity too, which became a real issue after the 2016 election. Technology, we have to stay up to date on, you know, what are the ways that we can do this that meet our requirements that have set forth. And about every 10 years, we're getting brand new election equipment. Public relations, reaching out to the public, trying to recruit people. HR, like I said, we're hiring people. So looking at hiring 400 people for one day. You're going to hire them to do a job on one day. I need 400 people. Look how hard it is in Michigan right now to hire people. You see help wanted signs everywhere. You can imagine how hard it is for election officials to be able to hire that many people. The mail, we have to be like up to date on what all the requirements are by the Postal Service. We have to have like, we're in constant contact with the Postal Service all throughout an election cycle. Street file maintenance. So you have to know, like, if a new subdivision has been added into your community, you have to make sure that you've added those streets and those addresses into the qualified voter file database, so that if someone comes in to register and they're brand new, they just bought one of these brand new houses in a brand new subdivision, you actually have their street address in the database in there. So we have someone who specifically puts that information in. Voter registration, all the up-to-date laws on that. Military and overseas voting, about our requirements by law of, and making sure that we have their ballots to them on the date that the law requires us to do that. Candidates and campaign finance. Campaign finance is typically handled in Michigan at a county level or a state level, depending on what office someone is filing for. And candidate filings, depending on what they're filing for, take place at different levels also. So Michigan is a little different there too. Like I said, the project management piece of it, the polling places, as I was having, you know, initial conversation with all of you, securing polling sites is incredibly difficult right now, especially with COVID and a pandemic. We lost a lot of our sites when it came to churches, when it came to senior facilities, not being able to host large groups of people any longer. And now some schools, due to physical security reasons, are giving second looks about whether they will allow precincts to be there. Advanced voting on this wheel, we'll call that absentee voting here in Michigan, where people can get an absentee ballot prior to election day. And just the general logistics of running an election. For instance, I have to rent out like 3 U-Haul trucks so that we can put all of the equipment and get all the equipment to all the places that they're supposed to be. And we have to have all of this done on the Monday prior to the election. So at what time will we be at this school to be able to unload all of this? So it's all the logistics of putting all that together. There are a lot of things that the local clerk has to do. And typically we're planning out as far as like even a whole year in advance of some of these things. And we're also, as far as like where they're going to be, who's going to work, any changes that we have to make, especially now due to COVID. And then you start looking at ordering all of your election materials. Say for an August primary, we're putting those orders in May. So like 3 months prior to an election, the local clerk is putting their orders in as far as for their AV apps and those sort of things. And the next slide, please. So I've kind of talked about like all of the responsibilities, and I apologize. I could really like talk to you about this for like 2 hours. There's so much to cover here. So we have a short period of time. I did work at the local level, as I mentioned. In March of this year, I did accept a position at the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, which is a federal agency. So I'm now working for the federal government. If you want to go to the next screen. So the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, some people, when they think about us, there are only a few things that really kind of come to mind for them. Number one, we're actually not a well-known agency because we are so small. A lot of people don't even know that we exist. But it is through the EAC where we adopt what are called voluntary voting system guidelines. And it is through the EAC that all of the election equipment that is used across the country gets certified. So whether that vendor can actually put that type of election equipment out on the market, they have to have certification through us, which goes through testing laboratories. and certifies those voting systems. So we were created by the Help America Vote Act in 2002. So we're not only one of the smaller agencies. Right now, we only have about 50 employees. We're looking to double that in the next 2 years. But we were brought about through the Help America Vote Act. So we're not even very old. We're less than 25 years old as an agency, which is actually very young in the federal realm. Some of the other things that we're responsible for are the National Mail Voter Registration Form, and what's the wording going to be on there? What's it going to look like so that this form can be used from state to state? Additionally, what languages are we going to translate that form into so that we're hitting some of the most widely used languages in our country? So our agency in particular is overseen by 4 commissioners. They're all 4 appointed by the president and confirmed by the US Senate. 2 are Republicans and 2 are Democrats. And so those 4 oversee our agency. So you have the 4 commissioners, and then you have the executive director, and then under the executive director are 2 senior advisors, which I am one of those senior advisors. And we're required to submit an annual report every year to Congress that tells all about our agency, what we're doing, what kind of progress we've made, and what HAVA is requiring of us, how are we meeting that mission? And so we hold various public meetings. For instance, we just held one this week to talk about certifying electronic poll books. And so we just held a meeting on that to meet with all the vendors as well as the public to tell where we're at in the process of certifying electronic poll books. So some of our other part of our mission is that we provide resources for election officials. So you can look on here what some of those resources are. So this is considered to be the clearinghouse portion, if you will. And clearinghouse, that is one of the areas that my team works in. And so my team consists of specifically 4 former election officials, people who have boots on the ground experience that have actually administered elections before. All 4 of the individuals who serve on my team are all hired from different states so that we have equal representation across the country because the states run the elections so differently. So we're looking at how can we help election officials better do their jobs. And so that is one of the charges of the EAC from HAVA. Next slide. The other thing that we also do are provide resources for voters. So if a voter is maybe moving from state to state and they're not really sure what the requirements are in their state for registering to vote, they can come to our site and we actually have all of that information there for them that will take them to their particular state and show them what site to go to. We also dispel election misinformation, as you can see on there. As far as being a poll worker, we tell people how they can register with their local community to be a poll worker. So we're not only providing resources for election officials, we're also looking out for voters and seeing how can we help voters in this process? What can we do to provide them more information and put that at their fingertips so that they're more likely to vote? So clearinghouse products, this is one of the things that I just mentioned. If you want to go to the next slide. So for my particular team, these are 4 documents that we have put out since I've been on board in March. So everybody from my team has come on since March. And these are 4 documents that we have put together. So you can see in the upper left-hand corner, it is a guide to redistricting. We felt that it was very important given the fact that we just had the census and that the new district lines are going to be drawn. And when that all comes into place, what you're looking at is something that only takes place for election officials every 10 years. So for a lot of election officials, they were not in their position 10 years ago. So for instance, even though if I were still in Rochester Hills right now, even though in Bloomfield Township, I had been the deputy clerk for a long time, I had not actually been the township clerk or city clerk through a redistricting process. And so when you're looking at the fact that we've seen also since 2020, a huge turnover across the country of election officials leaving their jobs, A lot of people who will be serving as election officials over from 2022 and beyond have never walked through a redistricting process in their community. So we put together a guide of best practices for election officials of things that they can do in order to best move forward with redistricting. Election audits, huge topic around the country, right? Like for the last year, everybody's been talking about audits. But audits can be kind of confusing, and there are multiple different methods used for audits. I mean, there are performance-based audits, there are risk-limiting audits, and so we put together this about 20-page document that talks about every kind of election audit done across the country, and also tells you what types of audit specific states are using. Michigan actually has one of the most stringent election audit processes here out of any of the states, because right now we're doing performance-based audits and we're also doing risk-limiting audits. So when you look at that, performance-based audits are often looking at, did the clerk put the notice of election in the paper at the time they were supposed to? Did they run a logic and accuracy test when they were supposed to do that? And they're looking at things like, did the totals tape match the number of individuals in the electronic poll book? So the risk limiting audit comes back along, and it's looking more at the results of the election. With the audit that we're doing, does it prove that the winner is still the winner and the loser is still the loser? So we combine both of those audits here in Michigan, and we do a lot of auditing in our state that is way more extensive than what you see across the country. So speaking of audits, another document that we put out recently was on chain of custody. So talking about all the way from when the audit, the ballots start at, we received it from the vendor, to now we have them in the clerk's office. Now the clerk's office has sent them to the precinct, and now the ballots have now gone to the precinct, and now they've gone through the tabulator. The chairperson has now brought them back to the clerk's office on election night, and the ballots are stored in the clerk's office. Talking about chain of custody of ballots, equipment, seals, all of those things, it's all covered in this document. And then this last document we just put out in this week is because this is Native American Heritage Month. We just put out a voting access for Native Americans, case studies and best practices for election officials who under Section 203 under the Voting Rights Act are required to they might have met a threshold of the number of Native Americans in their community, that they now have to provide resources to Native Americans in their community that would might be translations of ballots, things like that, voting instructions. So we just put that one out also. So that's kind of just in a really quick nutshell, things that I used to do, things that I'm doing now. And sorry for talking 100 miles a minute, but I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
All right, I'll stop sharing here, and then it looks like we have a couple hands up already. So yeah, if folks have questions, just raise a hand and I'll call on you just so we have a orderly process. So Dominica, if you want to start.
Sure. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to speak to us, Ms. Barton. That was so informative and so interesting. I knew, like before this event, I knew that Michigan was more decentralized than other comparable states, but I was really shocked to learn that Michigan has over 1,600 election officials. That is pretty extreme, especially compared to Ohio. I think you said that it was just over 80 in the entire state of Ohio. So given that rather extreme nature of our local control model here in Michigan, has there been any analysis of how effective our election administration is compared to other states? I know that you mentioned that we have a lot of audits, and I know that Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson conducted literally hundreds of audits after the most recent presidential election. But I'm wondering if that's still, like just the fact that we do audits, I'm wondering if it still reflects that we are more effective, or if having so many election officials makes it more ineffective and more inefficient.
Well, I think anytime you have a system where you have more people, obviously, you know, that can be a blessing and a curse, right? You know, the fact that we have so many election officials, we are so decentralized. Like I mentioned, I love the fact that it gives us this really great checks and balances with elections where, like, I'm not checking my own work. The county's not checking their own work. The state's not checking their own work. We're all checking each other's work, right? And so I think there's that layer that is a benefit to us. I mean, you also have the fact when you have over 1,600 people and you have turnover in those positions, it's very easy to lose institutional knowledge and experience. And so in townships, for instance, as I mentioned, they're all elected clerks. Sometimes you have people being elected into positions who have absolutely no experience or past knowledge of running an election. And so you have those types of scenarios also that can provide challenges into running elections. And so, yes, I think that there are pluses to it. I also think that it provides us a few challenges, and that's why I think it's so important that we have those checks and balances in place, because we do have sometimes brand new people running elections that have never done that before, or they weren't groomed coming up through their local clerk's office to take that position when the clerk retired.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I love that point with potential loss of institutional knowledge. I wonder too if that kind of goes into whether it's better to have elected clerks versus appointed clerks, because it might be the case that somebody who's appointed would have more institutional knowledge, knowing people who are in positions to appoint them to that position, as opposed to somebody who could just run for election but not actually know much about what the position entails. Do you mind if I follow up with another question to that? If you think that one system is better than the other with regard to appointed versus elected?
Yeah, well, some of my closest friends are elected, so I'm going to like dance all around this one, to be honest with you. So Bloomfield Township had an elected clerk. And to be honest with you, when Jan came on, she had been a township trustee prior to that. So she did have previous township knowledge of how things are, but she had never been an election official. She had a PhD, very smart woman, and she chose a deputy. She chose me, which I had been a township employee at that time for 8 years. And so she brought people on her staff that were knowledgeable about what they were doing. So I think that while the chief election official might come in and be brand new, I think any good leader surrounds themselves with people who already know what they're doing, right? So they bring people on their team who have knowledge about what they're doing. It is a rare occasion, and I think it would be incredibly foolish if someone were elected in a clerk's office to come in and wipe out the staff that had served for many years, because they are the ones really that are the hands-on institutional knowledge people, your staff. So I think there's some, respect that goes there, that you do have people that are working there. Chris Swope is one of the best clerks in the state of Michigan, and Chris is the Lansing clerk. He's one of my very good friends, and he's elected, and he's been in that position for a long time. So some elected clerks actually do serve for long periods of time. However, you do have the potential of every 4 years that they have to vie for that position. So I wouldn't say that one is better than the other. I would just say that it's important, if you are a new person coming in and being elected, that you use the wisdom and the experience that your staff currently has to help you get through and to learn the process as you go along. I also strongly encourage anyone who is looking to run as a township clerk or in an elected position to serve as an election inspector, so they at least have some, hey, I've been out there in a precinct, I know what it's like, I know how the process works, to give yourself some knowledge there too of how that works, and not just like jump in without ever having done any of those things. Also, a lot of us local clerks are always willing to, you can always be a poll watcher, right? I mean, the law says you can do that. You could just go sit and watch what happens in the polling place. You could be, a worker in an absentee room, which I strongly suggest that if you're going to work in a large community, that you volunteer in an absentee room to work as an inspector before you run for office to be an election official.
Thank you. That's all very helpful to learn.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Can I ask one follow-up to that? Calder or Zach, do you mind if I jump in for? Sure. I just wanted to say, what do you with the turnover? Is there there's often an incumbency bias for most offices. I think is that the same for city clerk? Is that whoever's in it tends to get reelected, or is that it seems like the kind of thing that people don't research in advance, and so they just go with who's there. Is that accurate?
Well, like I said, most of the city clerks are appointed, but I would say just any elected position, period. But I think sometimes that the clerk's positions are often overlooked and not really researched that well, to be honest with you. I have a friend, and I'm not going to out them on here, who is an elected clerk, who has said to me, if I would have known what all the township clerk does, I would have ran for treasurer. So, and I'm not bashing the treasurers. I'm just saying that there are a lot of things that the clerks do that a lot of people don't realize that it's part of their responsibilities in doing that. And it's not, you're not just coming in there. And unfortunately, our title of clerk lends a lot of people to believe that we're glorified secretaries, and we're not. And so I think that there's some misconception to just of what all happens. Like I said, I think most people think in our office, all we do are run elections. And Zach can tell you that's just one component of a lot of other things that we do.
Speaking of Zach, you can ask your question next.
Awesome. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Tina, thank you for your presentation. I really loved it. My question is, what in your opinion is the largest obstacle to the administration of elections, specifically to Michigan or nationwide or otherwise? What change in the law would help the most?
Oh gosh, that's a really big one. So I would say the biggest obstacle to for elections and election administration is probably politics. You know, that's one of the challenges that we face most election officials, to be honest with you, even if they run on a ballot with a party. So for instance, all the township clerks have to say whether they're a Republican or a Democrat, and county clerks have to do the same. I will be honest with you, most election officials I know stay out of the partisan fray. Like, that is not their thing. They are there to run elections. They are there to do business, and they are there to do it with integrity and to do it ethically. And so you won't find election officials often going off on partisan tangents. They just don't do it, especially at the local level. It just doesn't happen. And I think some of the frustrations that election administrators have is that the laws and the processes that are getting made in Lansing, number one, are done by people who have never done the job, or have never served as an election inspector, or don't even know what it's like at the precinct, or never, observed in an absentee room. And they're making rules and regulations that they don't truly understand the domino impact that it has on election administration. And, they're doing it more from a partisan spin or a partisan thought process. And really what we're all saying is, we want what's best for the voter. We want what's best for election administration. That's it for us, those two things. And I don't really know that I would say the one thing that could make probably the biggest impact nationwide on elections would be funding. Back after 2016, in January of 2017, they deemed elections as critical infrastructure. So, we're supposed to be critical infrastructure now. What they have failed to do is fund it as critical infrastructure. They've called it that. They've said this is so important that if this were to fail, it impacts our entire country in a negative way. So we're going to call this critical infrastructure. But by the way, we're not going to fund you in a way that shows that we think that it's critical infrastructure. So I think that would be the biggest thing that they could do on a national scale that would impact elections in a positive way, is to fund it properly.
Steve?
Yeah, so I have a few questions. One is with the partisan, most people that you're saying, most people don't care about that. They want to do more just run an election with integrity. It seems like that may be shifting now, as people are in the last even two to 3 years or what have you, as kind of claims of election misinformation are escalating. Do you what do you see that looking like kind of going forward? Have you seen any evidence that that's happening at scale, or is that just a few isolated examples we hear about? But then and kind of tied to that, how do you you've spoken out on kind of the disinformation things, what do you see as the kind of path forward on de-escalating the disinformation and rebuilding trust? So yeah, two related questions, I think.
Big questions too, right? Y'all are wanting me to save the world's problems. That's what you're doing.
Not necessarily solve it, just like tell us how we can contribute to solving.
Well, you know, and to be honest, and it makes me incredibly sad in my heart that a lot of career election officials are walking away from their jobs. They are stepping away because of, for their own peace, their own physical and mental health. They're doing that. And so I think that there's, you know, this, it makes me sad. Like I look at Neil Kelly, who, you know, out in California, who has been an election official for many years, very well respected across our entire country, you know, stepping down. You know, you have a county clerk in Texas who's been doing this for over 30 years, choosing to not run again, where we're looking at the impact that the profession is having on us, physically, mentally, emotionally, all of these things, and looking at from the wide scope and saying, I'm not sure that I want to do this anymore. And unfortunately, I think we're seeing this in public service kind of in multiple areas, not just for election officials, but election officials have been specifically targeted over the last year. So I do think that we are seeing, for me in particular, I was already ready to move on, you know, after the November 2020 election, which is why I threw my hat in the ring for the county clerk's office to run for that. But I knew I was ready to do something else and to do something that I could have an impact on a larger scale. So I was able to find, you know, the position at the EAC and to know that I can still do good work for election officials. At this time, obviously, we're probably not going to see the impact of how this, who is going to replace those who have walked away until the 2024 election. Because in 2020, all the township clerks were just reelected in Michigan. So they have 4-year terms ahead of them, those township clerks do. So do the county clerks. So until 2024 and probably actually 2023, when we start seeing people say, hey, I'm going to run for this office next year, and they start campaigning and raising money, we're probably not going to really see to what degree election officials are looking to be replaced by people who on one side or the other have, you know, extreme partisan preferences. That being said, we also have to understand there are laws to protect the election process and the integrity of the election, of things that we have to do, and your partisan preferences cannot sway that. That is what the law says you have to do. That is what you have to do.
I'll jump in with a question. You have a super interesting perspective, I think, coming from like hyper-local and then now moving to the federal level. Was there anything that you learned when you moved into your current role that you wish you had known when you'd been working at the local level, or that surprised you? Yeah, when you had that new perspective.
Honestly, I didn't realize how many federal agencies or groups were out there that work with federal agencies that have resources at our fingertips. You know, and I think that that's, you know, kind of on a local level, you kind of get stuck in this little bubble, or even in your state, you get stuck in this bubble of, I think this is all that exists out there. And now that I'm at the federal level, I'm like, I had no idea that website existed, or I had no idea this resource was available. I mean, so there are a lot of things out there that I think there's almost this danger of too much information sometimes, where it's like when, you know, I used to have a friend who always said, when something's everywhere, it's nowhere. You know, when you see it everywhere, then you don't even realize that it's there anymore because it's everywhere, right? And so, but it's like with these websites were everywhere, but for me, they were nowhere because I didn't even know they existed. You know, and all these different groups. So I'm always, the Michigan clerks have a Facebook forum that's a closed page just for the clerks. And so I'm like constantly going out there and putting stuff on their Facebook page saying, hey, everybody, did you know about this? Or I'm always sharing resources with them because I want them to know that these things exist. And so, yeah, it's opened my eyes to a lot of things that I'm like trying to share as much as I possibly can.
Nice. Well, we are getting down to it. If no one else has any questions, I guess I'll end with one. You kind of touched on some things to be concerned about, but in your role and from what you've seen, is there anything that gives you hope going forward, or that you think we're in a really good spot with when it comes to our elections here in Michigan and nationwide?
Yeah, I think I'm a positive person, right? So I always want to look at this. Number one, in 2016, we came out of that election cycle super focused on cybersecurity. We were really worried about nation state actors and black hat actors, how they were going to penetrate our systems and things like this. And we built this really robust cybersecurity system all across the country. We were making sure our QVF here in Michigan, our qualified voter file, was more secure than ever. And we were putting all these, multi-factor authentication things in place. And I think anytime you have something happen, you have opportunity to learn from it. And how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? Or what can we put in place? And so one of the things we've learned as election officials is we have to share a lot more information than what we're sharing. We have to make things available to people and put things in. And I don't like to say the word that elections need to become more transparent, because let me tell you, elections are already transparent. What we have to do better is to get people to pay attention to the transparency of them. We've always been doing logic and accuracy tests before an election to see, does the machine actually read the ballot the way it's supposed to? But you know what? I've been doing elections for 15 years. I have never had more than one person ever show up to them. And the vast majority of the time we've never had anybody show up, and so the processes are out there to be more transparent, but what do we have to be transparent? But what can we do to magnify that? So maybe now we live stream the logic and accuracy test. Maybe we live stream our canvassing, maybe we live stream our audits, things like that. So it's like taking the transparency of it, magnifying it so it's on a greater scale, because to be honest with you, none of you are probably going to come to one of the local clerk's offices and sit down and watch the logic and accuracy test. But if you knew you could click on a link while you were eating your lunch and watch a portion of it, you might find that interesting, right? And you might actually do that. And so we have to use technology to look about how do we put all of this good information that we have, all of these really transparent and intense processes of the election, how do we put them out there so people have greater access to them? And so I think that that's what we have to do. The transparency is there. We just have to magnify it. We have to keep sharing information. I'm one that's not about like responding to every single lie that I see out there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put every truth that I have out there. So I'm going to keep magnifying truth. They can keep arguing lies. I'm going to keep magnifying truth, because I will tell you the vast majority of municipalities believe their own clerk. They believe their local clerk. They're always concerned about other clerks, right? They're always concerned about other communities. But on a local level, they have high confidence in their local election officials. So we as locals have to reach out to our locals and convince them of truth and show them truth and magnify that transparency. And I think that's how we tackle this is from the ground up. Because when you look at the big problem itself of misinformation out there, it can seem so overwhelming to do that. And there is no federal agency on its own that is big enough to dispel all of the lies. There is no state on its own that is big enough to do that. So we have to serve in partnerships and say, how can I work with you and you work with me and you share this and I'm going to share this. And if we all keep sharing truth out there, the truth will ultimately prevail.
I think that is a great note to end on. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your insights. We really appreciate it.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here with all of you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Zach, for thinking of me and reaching out to me. I appreciate that. And I still might hire you someday. So just keep that in the back of your mind.
No, this has been very great. It's been a pleasure to have you. And I already know that once the semester's done, I'm going to be rewatching to like get a little bit more, because that was a lot of information.
Thank you again. I appreciate it. And you guys all have my email out there. I think Zach even has my cell phone, but I'm very accessible. I love working with students. So whatever way you can find me to reach out to me, if you have any questions, anything like that, please do so. I'd love to talk with you.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
You too. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Thanksgiving.